Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. Erik Halvorsen, historian from Norway, arrived in the remote village of Desavik at the height of winter. Snow blanketed the cobbled roads while icy winds sliced through the pines like silent razors. His goal was clear, or so he thought, to study a series of ancient stone carvings recently unearthed by local archaeologists. But from the moment he stepped into Desavik, a strange pressure settled in his chest. Something about the place felt alert, as if it had been waiting for him long before he ever arrived. Desavik wasn't welcoming. The houses, built from aged blackened pine wood, lined up in grim formation, cold and silent. The villagers stared but never greeted. Some even paused mid-task when Erik passed by, as though his presence disrupted something sacred. Though he was no stranger to the silence of Norway's forests, this silence felt different, controlled, restrained, as though any sound might wake something that must not be disturbed. He rented a room from a mute widower who only opened the door in silence. Inside, the walls were lined with faded paintings, each depicting a tall, hooded figure standing beneath the full moon. The details were unnerving, surreal in their vividness. Erik didn't ask about them. He simply took mental notes. His first night in Desavik was wrapped in unnatural stillness. No owls, no wind brushing branches, not even a dog barking. It was as if the village existed outside the world. Or worse, like it no longer belonged to the world at all. The next morning, Erik wandered toward the edge of the village, following an old trail marked on his research map. The trail led to the northern woods, the supposed location of the ancient carvings. But before he could enter the forest, he encountered a massive wooden barrier. Primitive, yet purposeful. Strung across it were bone charms, decaying cloth, and symbols that resembled carved eyes and severed tongues. A crude sign hung beneath them, written in an archaic language Erik recognized from pre-Viking manuscripts. This wasn't a conservation effort. It was a warning. A spiritual blockade, possibly a curse. Still, curiosity tugged at him. He didn't cross the barrier. Not yet. But he did take photographs and copied the symbols into his notebook. Each sigil seemed to whisper a story too ancient for words. As he turned back, dusk began to fall. A light fog crept in from the forest edge. Erik had the unsettling feeling that something inside the woods was listening. Not an animal. Not a person. Something older. Something that understood how humans think. The following day, Erik visited a small wooden tavern in the village square. It resembled a forgotten cabin, lit only by oil lamps and filled with the scent of damp wood. That's where he saw Astrid, a young woman with pale blonde hair and a wool coat too large for her slight frame. She sat alone, stirring something in a clay bowl, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She wasn't like the others. Her gaze didn't lower in submission, it cut straight through him. There was sorrow in her expression, but also defiance. When Erik tried sketching a few symbols from one of the tavern's old wall hangings, Astrid silently approached, looked at his notes, then walked away with a slight shake of her head. He didn't know why, but from that moment, her presence lingered. Every time he passed the section of the village where she stood staring into the trees, it felt like she was searching for an answer he hadn't yet asked. On the third night, just as Erik was reviewing his photographs of the symbols, a sound echoed from the northern woods. It wasn't a scream. It was a long, deep bellow, like a horn blown from beneath the ground. He opened the window, but the streets were still. Every home had gone dark. Snow fell quietly. But everything was wrong. The next morning, Erik followed the direction of the sound and found prints near the forest barrier. But they weren't human. The tracks were massive and melted into the snow, neither claw nor foot, but something entirely unnatural. When he touched the center of the imprint, it was still warm. He took a picture, but the camera betrayed him. The image showed nothing but a black void where the track had been. As if light refused to reflect from it. Erik began to understand. What he was investigating wasn't just folklore or relics of a forgotten people. It was something still alive. Something that walked beside time, but chose to stay hidden unless called upon. Erik returned to the original stone carving site, the reason he'd come to Desavik in the first place. Hidden behind frostbitten bushes near the northern forest, the stone had originally featured ancient geometric patterns, common among protective symbols from the early Norse era. But this morning, it was different. The carvings now depicted a tall figure holding a torch, surrounded by severed heads and a ring of fire beneath a full moon. The change was impossible. No one could have recarved the stone in just 2 nights, not in sub-zero temperatures, not without leaving marks or traces. Erik stood before it in silence. The stone no longer felt like an artifact, it was a manuscript. A silent, evolving narrative told not through words, but through presence and intent. It was no longer telling what had happened. It was beginning to show what was coming. Later that evening, as the village prepared for its weekly blackout, an unexplained custom where every candle and lamp must be extinguished before midnight, Erik couldn't sleep. Outside, the snow fell heavier, cloaking the ground in a thick white hush. He sat by the window, his journal open, trying to make sense of what the altered carvings meant. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from a growing sense of intrusion. Around 2 in the morning, while the blackout cloaked Desavik in total darkness, Erik heard something just below his window. At first, it sounded like snow shifting, but soon became rhythmic, like something dragging itself through the thick ice. The sound wasn't heavy like a beast. It was calculated. Purposeful. He didn't dare move. His breath fogged the glass. Then, in the silence, came a whisper, not in Norwegian, but in an ancient dialect he barely understood. The words were low, broken, like breath forced through cracked lungs. He froze as the voice repeated itself, again and again, just beneath the window frame. The tone was not pleading. It was summoning. At dawn, Erik confronted Astrid at the edge of the village. She was standing barefoot in the snow, facing the forest, lips moving in silent prayer. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she hadn't slept in days. On the ground before her were small animal bones arranged in a spiral, each pointing toward the woods. Erik didn't speak. He simply watched. Astrid finally turned and handed him a thin, wooden charm shaped like an open eye. Her hands shook, and her expression was that of someone burying a secret too dangerous to share. She pointed once to the forest, then to her mouth, then slowly traced her finger across her throat. She was warning him, speak nothing, ask nothing, and above all, do not enter the woods. Erik took the charm, but didn't know what to do with it. As he returned to his lodging, he passed 3 villagers standing still beside a frozen well, staring directly at him without blinking. Their mouths moved, but made no sound. It was as if the entire village had fallen under a spell of silence, bound by an ancient fear they couldn't name. Erik decided to review the footage from his field camera placed near the forest barrier. It had been recording since his first day. He locked himself in the attic, drew the curtains, and loaded the SD card onto his laptop. The files played normally for a while, snow, trees, occasional passing deer. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., on the 3rd night, the image shifted. A tall, shadowed figure appeared at the tree line. It didn't move like a person, it glided, as if suspended just above the ground. It paused near the barrier, raised one elongated arm, and pointed directly at the camera. No face could be seen, only blackness beneath a cowl or hood. Suddenly, the image glitched violently, then cleared. The figure was now gone. But the final frame, before the feed cut to static, showed something Erik hadn't noticed while filming. A new carving had appeared on the barrier itself. A spiral etched deep into the wood, identical to the charm Astrid had given him. The footage was time-stamped. It was real. But when he tried to replay it, the video file had corrupted itself entirely. That night, the storm thickened into a whiteout. Erik stayed inside, but his thoughts swirled like the blizzard outside. Around midnight, a violent knock shattered the silence. He rushed to the door, no one was there. But across the snow, small barefoot prints led from his door toward the forest. They weren't childlike. They were, too long, too narrow. In panic, Erik ran toward Astrid's house. The door stood open, swaying in the wind. Inside, the fireplace was out, the table overturned, and the clay bowl she always stirred lay shattered on the floor. On the wall, drawn hastily in soot, was the same spiral symbol. But there was no sign of Astrid. Not even footprints. Only her wool coat remained, lying in the snow like she had melted into the earth. Unable to sleep, driven by fear and guilt, Erik took his camera and the wooden charm and returned to the forest barrier just before dawn. The snow had stopped, and an unnatural calm blanketed Desavik. There, in the clearing, stood something that hadn't been there before, a wooden effigy, nearly 3 meters tall, formed of antlers, bark, and human bone. Its face was a blank disc, carved with an open eye and a bleeding mouth. At its feet lay 7 severed animal heads, arranged in a circle. The charm around Erik's neck began to burn, not physically, but in a way that made his chest tighten and his limbs stiffen. Then, he saw it. Beyond the effigy, deeper within the forest shadows, something moved, tall and slow. A figure cloaked in frost and smoke. Not walking. Floating. Its eyes glowed like dying embers, and where it passed, the trees bent backward, recoiling in fear. Erik couldn't breathe. His legs buckled, and for a moment, the world turned white. When he awoke, he was back in his room. His camera was gone. His clothes were soaked. And carved onto the wall above his bed, in jagged, ancient script, was a message. You have seen the Watcher. Now you are part of the village. The morning after witnessing the Watcher, Erik awoke with a sharp pain in his lower back and a fever that wouldn't break. Despite the haze clouding his thoughts, he noticed something strange. The floor beneath his bed, where the ancient script had been carved, was slightly raised. Driven by unease, he pried it open, revealing a small compartment hidden beneath the old wood. Inside was a bundle wrapped in leather, ancient and stiff with age. Within it, he found a journal, written in faded ink in a language he had only ever seen in museum archives. Through careful translation, he realized it belonged to a man named Willem Gerhardt, a missionary who had visited Desavik in 1782. The journal entries detailed his growing concern over the village's isolation, its secretive rituals, and the constant reference to a guardian spirit they called Vactor av Dodens Grens, the Watcher of Death's Border. Willem had written of villagers vanishing, of boneless creatures seen in the mist, and of waking each night to chants carried by the wind. His final entry ended abruptly. Tonight, they said the Watcher walks again. I heard him beneath the floor. The journal also contained maps, drawings of Desavik from 2 centuries prior. Erik noticed something shocking. The village was laid out in the same spiral pattern etched into the wooden charm and the carvings. The town wasn't designed for convenience or survival, it was a summoning circle, carefully constructed over generations. Every home, every pathway, even the central well, formed parts of a larger occult diagram. Erik remembered Astrid's refusal to speak of certain topics and the villagers' terrified silence. It all began to fit. The people of Desavik weren't victims of some haunted legend. They were participants. Keepers of a pact so old it had become ritual. But who, or what, was the other party in the pact? The Watcher wasn't just a legend. It was the guardian of Desavik, awakened not by accident, but by need. A protector summoned only when balance had been broken, when someone had trespassed too far. As the sky darkened and snow began to fall once more, Erik felt compelled to return to the forest edge. But this time, something had changed. The barrier of carved wood had been shattered, not broken by human hands, but splintered from the inside, like something had forced its way out. Beyond it, a narrow path now stretched into the trees, flanked by broken antlers and torn animal pelts hanging from the branches. It hadn't been there before. The forest had opened to him, not as a welcome, but as a summons. A rustling wind carried strange smells, burnt pine, blood, and something ancient, metallic. Erik knew he had crossed a threshold the moment he stepped past the last post. The forest was alive. Not in the way living things are, but in a watching, remembering kind of way. Every step forward was met with whispers just beyond the trees. Deep in the forest, Erik came upon a structure, half buried in ice and moss. It was a cottage, unlike any in Desavik. Made of stone and animal bones, with windows blackened from within. He recognized the spiral pattern carved into its door, identical to the one that haunted him in dreams. Inside, the air was warmer, stifling and heavy. Dust covered everything, but the furniture looked recently used. On a table in the corner sat a series of old photographs. Erik's breath caught in his throat. Each photo showed villagers from different time periods, early 1900s, 1950s, even the present day. But in every photo, the same figure stood among them, a tall, gaunt man with black eyes, always near the edge of the frame. Sometimes in a cloak, sometimes in plain clothes. Always watching. In the last photo, the newest one, the man stood behind Astrid. And beside her, was Erik. Erik stumbled backward, the air around him pulsing with a quiet hum. The shadows in the corners of the cottage began to shift, and a pressure, like deep water, pressed against his chest. As he fled the house, snow began to fall again, this time in sharp, icy flakes that burned his skin. He ran, blindly, until the trees gave way and the village came back into view. But something was wrong. The houses were empty. Lights flickered unnaturally. The well was sealed shut with chains. Then, he saw them, eyes. Dozens of glowing red eyes watching from rooftops, from inside windows, from beneath the snowdrifts. Silent. Patient. As if waiting for his return. From behind him, in the distance, came the low, resonant sound of a horn, a single note that shook the ground beneath his feet. It wasn't a call of warning. It was a call of welcome. Erik realized the truth too late. Desavik hadn't been cursed. It had been protected, for centuries. But now, the Guardian had chosen him as the new key. He was no longer an outsider. The village had taken him. And the Watcher had finally crossed the border. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.